Recording in progress.
Christina, the floor is yours.
Thank you and welcome, a warm welcome and good morning or good afternoon from the European Training Foundation. We are continuing our series of webinars focused on the activation, skills development and upskilling and reskilling elements in the context of changing economic and social conditions. It is my pleasure to welcome you. I'm Cristina Marauzza, working at the European Training Foundation as a labor market specialist. And together with our colleagues, we are looking forward to have the discussion on the innovation and adaptation elements in this changing times or very difficult conditions. So we hope that our event will be inspiring to you. The event will start now and we aim at concluding at 1 o'clock Central European time. We will have 3 sessions, one focused on the impact of flexibilization of the labor market on active labor market measures and upskilling and reskilling elements. Another session will focus on growing and gender gaps in the context of the pandemic. And the final session will look at the labor market information systems and the way they should inform the active labor market programs design, implementation, and monitoring. Few quick elements, technical elements about this webinar. You are very much encouraged to post your remarks and questions in chat. You can do it in all the working languages of the webinar. We have tried to be as inclusive as possible. So we have interpretation in Arabic, in Russian, in Serbian, Bosnian, Croatian, and Montenegrin. We also have interpretation in Albanian, Turkish, and Macedonian. So please choose the language that you would like to follow in this event. Few rules, the usual one, please keep your microphone off when you are not speaking. During the event, we will also launch a couple of polls. It's very easy and we encourage you to reply to these polls. I finished this quick introduction here and it is my pleasure now to invite Manuela Prina, the head of the unit dealing with skills identification and development for the opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cristina, and a good morning, afternoon, and also evening to some of you. This morning, while I was coming to the ETF building, I was thinking, what am I going to say to this group of people who is extremely experienced and hands-on on the topic we're going to address today? And I was really overwhelmed by the idea of having the opportunity to spend a few hours together to learn from so many good ideas and experiences. Today we are here from 45 countries, I think online it's difficult sometimes to recognize the richness that we have around us. So I want to stress this because I think that despite the pandemic and despite we are all a bit tired of meeting in this modality, there is today a very important message that we have to highlight at the beginning of this seminar, which is the commitment and is also the alliance to actually put skills at the center of activation policies. As Christina was saying, we started 1 year ago a series of webinars to look in more details at the role of investing in skills as part of the active labor market policies. And in our first webinar, I remember we were actually talking about hacking the skills dimension, because most of the interventions that were put forward, in particular to mitigate the impact of the health crisis in partner countries, was not considering skills as part of the solution. Of course, we all know that in emergency, there are things that need to be taken care of, but we knew, and I think that all of you here today know very well, that also in previous crises and emergencies, we saw that countries that did not tackle the skills dimension actually had a hard time for much longer. So I think today what it would be really extremely great is to see this skills dimension emerging as really a part of the solution, not only to mitigate the impact of the health emergency and what has happened in all countries of the world, but also to face challenges, or let me say opportunities, depending on how we look at them, that are upcoming and are part of our society and the changes we see in all countries. There are at least 3 of those dimensions that also today will be part of our conversation. The first is the new forms of work, the way jobs and the work experience is being actually lived through by people. It's changing and it's very diversified. The second is the transitions that we face. The transitions not only in terms of looking at the new economic models where green and digital are part of what we actually talk about every day and are part of the business models of companies, but also of the economic vision of countries, but it's also the transitions that people are called to manage across their life, from school to work, and also in their employment and career path. And the third is the inclusion and the equity, which is always something that is not granted. Despite you know, the long history of human beings, there is something that when we don't give attention to it, it suddenly becomes always problematic. So inclusion, equity, investing in talent, making sure that we really give attention to individuals is never something that is a given. It's a challenge and it's a priority that we need to make sure it's part of our policies. Now, in this new era where diversity is definitely something that we face in our daily life, we know that skills, it's part of the solution, is part of what will make these transitions work. In all countries of the world, we can say that lifelong learning systems are still something that we need to work on a lot. In particular, to make sure that we have an individual approach to learning and to the investment in skills that take into account, of course, the needs of individuals and also their preferences and attitudes in terms of how do they learn. These are all things that need to be managed, and it's definitely not an easy task for those who are called to design and also implement active labor market policies. So today we're here to learn and to hear important experiences that will help us to also take decisions for the future. What does the ETF do in this dimension? The first is that we continuously give attention on how the different demands in the labor market impact on the skills needs. The second is to look into how lifelong learning systems can adapt to future demands. And definitely our attention is even stronger today in looking into how inclusion and equity should be always part of our design when we look at policies and we look also at actions. We're very grateful and we are very happy to share with you the studies that we have completed, that we started actually 1 year ago and that are now available on the web. This is only at the beginning of our engagement to make sure that good practices are shared and that could be serving as an inspiration, but also as a reference for all of us. We're also very grateful to all our partners, in particular UNICEF and the ILO, with whom we have been working a lot during this year, but also all partners in partner countries that have been really contributing to make sure that all those experiences are shared. With all of you, we want definitely to continue this dialogue and this to become even more concrete, as next year we will also engage in many countries on the inspiration of the skills agenda, the European Pillar of Social Rights, and also the Youth Guarantee Scheme that is gaining momentum in many, many countries. I think today we will have a very rich dialogue ahead. I look forward to hear all the experiences across the 3 sessions that we have together. And I think without further delay, I will pass the floor to my colleague Ivona for the first session. I thank all of you for being here, and I really look forward to an interaction, even if on the web. And thank you very much to all of you. Ivona, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Manuela, for such an inspiring introduction, and a really warm welcome to everyone who is joining us. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to our first session. Let's have a look on policy implications for activation and reskilling, as Manuela was saying, looking at emerging labor market and economic trends. We said we would look at new forms of employment in a broader context of labor market flexibilization, because this is what is happening and what we are observing currently. And let's have a look from the broader perspective of skills adaptation, from the perspective of the lifelong learning. I'm Ivona Ganko. I'm a labor market expert at the European Training Foundation. We've met most probably throughout those last months and throughout the webinars that we were having. And I'm here with a great pleasure with my colleague Eva Jansova, a human capital development expert of the ETF. And we will spend 1 hour together. So it would be very nice to still learning where are you joining us from, and please do not hesitate also to post your questions and comments in the chat, as we will try to take them during the session. So the core part of our session actually will be dedicated to a panel discussion with our distinguished guests who kindly agreed to share with us their reflections based also on their work at the international level, mainly at the European Union level. And we will have with us Mrs. Irene Mandl from the European Labour Authority, Dragos Adaskateli from the European Foundation for the Improvement of Living and Working Conditions, Eurofound, and Konstantinos Pauliakas from the European Centre for the Development of Vocational Training, CEDEFOP. They will share with us their recent research and observations from the topic that we will be covering throughout the session. But before I give the floor to Eva and our distinguished panelists, let me just quickly introduce the context of our today's discussion. As you may already know, ETF is very much engaged in the overall reflection, I would say international reflection on the current and the future economic, employment, but also social trends and their implications for policies. So the big question for us is how to catch the arising opportunities while mitigating challenges throughout some policy measures and policy tools. And already a while ago, we noticed actually that while such a debate is very lively at the level of developed countries, less attention is given to developing countries, which actually constitute the majority of ETF partner countries. At the same time, we also noticed that some trends are affecting in the same manner all the countries. But of course, then we are facing different dynamics, but also different responses to those trends that are coming to the countries with globalization, with aging, with strong technological shifts. We are observing that countries are catching up opportunities, but maybe they could catch them up in a more efficient and effective manner. With this, let me just share quickly a few elements for reflection that we are having, and they are coming from our studies. Let me just share my screen. I hope it can work. Yes, now it works. I had some problems before with my PowerPoint, so I really hope that now it will work. So let's have a very, very quick look at those new trends that we are observing. And let's have this reflection on the implications for policies and in particular for skills development. We already know that our countries that we are working with in the neighborhood are very different. There are different dynamics within the regions that we are somehow collecting them, but there are also different dynamics between the countries and within them. What we noticed recently that despite the really huge potential, in particular human capital potential of the countries, we face low productivity and very often inefficient use of those resources. We are also observing a huge impact of technological change. This with, in particular, digitalization that has been substantially accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic brings also industrial changes and strong sectoral shifts. And this we are particularly observing throughout the last 2 years, last year and this year. And with this, unfortunately, we also see an increasing economic and labor market volatility. So that brings, unfortunately, risks of social exclusion. And with those, new challenges to employment policies and there are certain groups that we see that are more affected than others, like, for example, young people and women. But then let's have this reflection also, what are then the implications for education and training systems to adjust to those changes and also to catch up the opportunities that these changes may bring actually. But with this, looking at our recent research, we notice that new forms of employment are growing. Why is it so? One of the elements that I just said is this technological shift. So we are seeing increasing self-employment, freelancing, remote work, but also platform work on international platforms. And the countries and the citizens of the countries are catching some of those opportunities through emergence of national startups, technological parks, but also a growing number of people that are actually directly connecting to international platforms. We made a specific research on the platform work in the 6 Eastern Partnership countries. Why so? Because we were already noticing from different sources that this element of the new form of employment is actually very much prevalent in Ukraine. But then, with a big surprise, we are discovering also other trends and a huge popularity as well in Belarus, but also in Armenia. Other countries are also catching up with those trends like Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Moldova. But then the question was that we posed, who is actually involved? And then, unfortunately, we noticed that not all the opportunities are caught and that not all the potential of those new forms of work is tapped, because mostly young people are involved. Well, we would say that's good, but then we are seeing that majority of them are actually young men, and the majority of them are from capital or another big cities. So here we were already a bit constrained with our findings, thinking that, okay, so we have those good opportunities also at the international level, that maybe we were also posing a question whether those opportunities can be actually an alternative to migration. Is it so? I still believe that we would need to think about policies that could direct catching up those opportunities. What we are also seeing that remote work is very much growing, and not only remote work as we are doing now. I am connected to the webinar from my home today, and this is a great opportunity also to meet you from different locations that most probably we wouldn't have in other circumstances. But here we are looking at remote work through different platforms where there is a demand for work also from ETF partner countries. In particular, we are observing huge demand for ICT, multimedia arts and design, but also interestingly for writing and translation. But how about on location? On location, meaning that the services are actually delivered physically. And here, also as in other sources, international sources that we were noticing, ride hailing, like taxi driving is the most demanded, but also delivery services like food delivery or parcel delivery. But what those findings show is this fostered labor market flexibilization and segmentation. And here we are observing segmentation within a skills dimension, high skills versus lower skills, strong gender segmentation, so men versus women, and geographical divide as well. So urban, where access to internet and internet infrastructure is easier, and those people that are living in more rural areas. Then what we are also seeing that is actually those new trends are not very much seen in the new policies. And there is a limited acknowledgement of those trends. In particular, labor regulations are not very well adapted to new forms of work. So then we were still asking, posing more questions. So what about policy making? What about social dialogue to push for the changes in the policies? Actually, what we are discovering is that social partners are not very much present in this dialogue. So there is a huge potential of engagement in the social dialogue and push for the right policies. Because unfortunately, what we see very, very strongly is a widespread informality and actually very limited coverage by employment policies, services, but also social benefits that are linked to those policies. Then, despite many opportunities in those new forms of work, actually we observe limited career development. This is also linked with the algorithmic management and the division of tasks that is very often happening automatically. But with all this, actually, while asking about new forms of employment, we discovered that even people engaged in such a work are not linked this work with precarity, as it's very much happening in developed countries, but they see it rather as an opportunity for job creation, and they see additional and higher income than in other sectors. And yes, it is a feasible alternative to migration because it gives the opportunities for international work, very often very fancy work for big companies, sitting as me today at my home. So with this, we then were posing another questions. And here I would like to put forward also for our further discussions in this session. What about connectivity? Of course, it's a must. Infrastructure, digital services. What about working conditions? We need to have a real reflection on labor market regulations, including on employment status of people engaged in the new forms of work, also about their taxation that would be easy managed. Then let's think about skill strategies to address skills demand in the new and appearing new sectors. Let's address limited career development, how to do that, how to really foster skill development opportunities that they are, because there is a strong on-the-job learning, how to recognize this learning. And then let's have reflection also on the role of active labor market policies, on the role of public employment services in supporting the transition into employment, but also from one job to another. One of the issues that we are seeing and we are putting forward also for reflection is the access to information. Yes, we see a feasibility of placing new forms of work as an opportunity. But very often there is no enough information on those opportunities. And then again, let's have a reflection on access to services, not only employment services, but how to guide people that they want to engage in such a work through counseling and career guidance, but also other support services. And what we are also now reflecting upon is how to extend our knowledge and understanding of the new trends, because we actually are noticing that many of those are not captured by traditional statistics. We don't see many of platform work unless we investigate specifically. We also do not very often observe freelance transactions. They are just invisible. And just one point and another issues for reflection. What are then implications for skills? What can we do about this from our perspective? As I said already, digital skills are a must, not necessarily at super higher level, but yes, then science and technology and ICT, because those skills are very much demanded. Then skills for other sectors like art and design. But interestingly, also, we need to think about good literacy skills, writing and translation, for example. For translation, then, language skills. In the countries that we focused our recent research, English and Russian in particular are very much demanded. But then what are the skills people need to be equipped to really be successful in these new types of work? First of all, they need to be entrepreneurial. They need to have good customer orientation and self-organizational skills. While? Because they need to organize their work. So they need to analyze well, and they need to solve problems because they are just receiving tasks to deliver. And then actually they are assessed based on the task that they are delivering. But with this, they also need to catch those opportunities. They need to catch clients. So they need to present themselves well, and they need to organize their work well, and they need to have good communication skills. And then another point for reflection. As I said, there are many opportunities for skills development within those new forms of work. But then there is a question about career management, and then people need to be also very much open to learn throughout their work. So yes, I put forward those points for the reflection throughout our session. What would be then implications for education and training system? How should we look from adult skills development perspective, how to recognize skills, how to validate them, how to certify them? And with this, I thank you very much. And now I give the floor to Eva and our distinguished guests for a continuation of this reflection. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ivona. Thank you for the introduction and for sharing with us the findings from the ETF study. But before we move to the panel discussion, we have a question for you, which you may see shortly on your screen. And yes, perfect. So basically, considering the new trends on the labor market and labor market flexibilization as introduced by Ivona, would you consider working as freelancer or offering your services on online platforms? And the options you can see on your screen and which you can choose and click on are yes, even as my main job, yes, as additional source of income, maybe if working conditions were better, or no, I prefer a stable contract. So you will have now few seconds to choose from one of these options to our question whether you would consider working as a freelancer or whether you would consider offering your services on online platforms. So yes, even as my main job, yes, as additional source of income, maybe, or no. And we will keep this poll open still for a few seconds to allow you to choose one of the option. And we will then see what are the results of our poll, whether we have many potential platform workers among us. So I think last 10 seconds, and then we will close. So still the last moment to opportunity to vote. And I believe we can close our first poll. And what are the results? Oh, so the results are relatively equally distributed, but we see that that is the most preferred option is yes as additional source of income. So taking all the responses together, we can see that the majority of you would consider working as a freelancer or platform worker. Thus, new forms of work could be seen as a potential future option for many of you. So thank you for this active participation and also for getting your opinions on this poll. And now I would like to welcome our three panelists who will share their views and evidence from recent research on new forms of employment and flexibilization trends on the labor market. And I also invite you, the audience, to comment and ask questions in the chat. I believe we have already some. And if the time allows, we may pick few of them at the end of this session, and we can ask our speakers to give their views on the questions. So as already introduced by Ivona, we have with us Irene Mandl, the head of unit from the European Labour Authority, Dragos Adaskalitei, research officer from the Eurofound, and Konstantinos Pouliakas, expert on skills and labor market from CEDEFOP. Thus, we have with us three representatives of the EU agencies who are very much involved in researching and monitoring the new trends on the labor market. So, as already presented by Ivona, emerging trends on the labor market pose many questions, especially when it comes to working conditions, protection of workers, but also their skills development. So my first question will be for Irene and Dragos. I hope we can see them shortly on the screen, who worked extensively on mapping emerging trends on the labor market in the EU countries. So my first question to you would be basically working conditions in flexible forms of employment, particularly when we look at platform workers, pose important concerns. So we know that informality, for example, in the Eastern Partnership countries, but also I believe in the EU countries, is widespread. So are there any examples of regulatory frameworks in the European Union countries that improve workers' protection and labor rights? So what do we know from your research? Irene and Dragos.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thanks, Eva, and the ETF also for the invitation. Maybe I'll start with that and then give the floor to Dragos. Maybe I focus more on the general perspective and leave Dragos for the working conditions part of that. In general, I think what we can see, what Ivona also mentioned in her introduction, that the current legislative frameworks, they don't tend to be very fit for purpose for the new developments, because what is happening on the labor market is kind of out of the box. And most of the legislations that we have, at least in Europe, they tend to be quite old, let's put it politely, and maybe not necessarily well adapted for the current specific situation. And I think that holds particularly true for the topic of platform work, where for the time being only a very low number of countries have dedicated legislation that deals with platform work. But before going into legislation, I think an important point that also Ivona mentioned is about information provision and awareness raising, because there are, even if not explicitly assigned, dedicated to platform work, in principle, at least in Europe, we do have very good legislative frameworks that protect workers, that give them good rights and entitlements and safeguard that there is decent work. But in many cases, it is not really clear whether that also covers platform workers and who has the responsibility. Is it the platform? Is it the worker? And I think that comes in combination to also what Ivona mentioned. For the other countries, we see the same trend in Europe, that the typical platform worker is very young, so they might not have that much exposure to labor law and to their rights and entitlements. So a first step that could help as to this regard would be a more dedicated, targeted information provision, awareness raising towards the workers. And here we do see some examples, notably at local level, where something like information counters have been established, including by, for example, social partners, but their visibility is not yet very well done. So there should be further promotion of these tools. And here, what one of our most recent research brought about is that as to this regard, social media could help a lot, because notably in platform work, everyone is in Facebook and other types of disinformation channels. So that could help to raise visibility. Getting back now to the legislative part, I want to focus more on regulations regarding social protection and taxation. So to your question about the informality, here in Europe, we see only 3-4 examples of where national legislators have taken a step, and they on the one hand go into the direction of increasing transparency. So for example, making platforms register, like is the case in Belgium, to a kind of an administrative body. And if then platform workers are working through these registered platforms, they benefit from a more favorable tax regime. So through that pathway, they try to cope a little bit with this informality, but that at the end is a completely voluntary initiative. So the effectiveness in practice is a little bit questionable. The other strand that we see is that there is legislation enacted to simplify the procedure that goes into the direction that most of the research finds that only a small number of platform workers do it as a main job, but the vast majority do it as a side activity, similar to what also came out of the poll right now. And then often having, and notably if then the platform worker is considered self-employed and has to do all these information provision to tax authorities, to social protection authorities themselves, it can be quite burdensome and cumbersome from them. So there are countries like, for example, Estonia or also France found ways of simplifying the procedure, that it can be either automated through cooperation with the platform, or with a bank, for example, or that there is a kind of a leaner process, that it becomes easier, and with that trying to incentivize rather than penalize workers or the platforms if there is the direction going of the informality. And I think I'll leave it for here for the moment, and would hand over to Dragos to complement. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Irene, for this very nice introduction. I would like to start by saying that your poll reflects very much the kind of distribution of platform workers in the European Union. So what we know about platform workers at the moment is that the majority of them are engaged in platform work and as a source of secondary income. There are very few at the moment. There are very few workers that do this on that work on platform and have income from platforms as a primary source of income. So around 3 million workers currently in the EU do this. Of course, this data is a bit outdated, and during the pandemic, I think that this might have increased. And this is relates very much to a question that Ivona has asked in the beginning, what are the opportunities and challenges that we see in platform work. And I think one of the opportunities that has been emphasized by the pandemic is that it provides to particular groups and to disadvantaged groups in particular, access to labor market and the opportunity to provide an income. On the other hand, as both Irene and Ivona have mentioned, platform work raises a host of challenges in terms of working conditions for platform workers. And in the European Union, although we don't have a lot of interventions, a lot of policy interventions that try to deal with working conditions of platform workers, what we can see at the moment is that there's an increased interest in actually trying to regulate the platform economy and implicitly to regulate the working conditions of platform workers. And at Eurofound, we have what we call the Platform Economy Repository that tries to be as comprehensive as possible and tries to track all the changes or initiatives that governments, social partners, platforms themselves try to actually implement in order to address the working conditions of platform workers. And I would very much want to underline that in the European Union, the working conditions of platform workers has been debated in relation to one specific angle which has dominated policy debate, and that is the employment status of platform worker, because the employment status is the kind of, let's say, entry point into providing workers or those who provide services to the platforms to provide access to social protection and to other rights associated with the employment status. And here there is a bit of a disconnect when we look at what is happening in platform economy, because on the one hand, the majority of platform of workers who perform or provide services on platforms are employed as self-employed workers, right? However, they perceive themselves, so survey data shows us that they perceive themselves as employees of platforms. So in that respect, there is this disconnect in which has created frictions within the platform economy and has raised the questions that you have raised earlier. Now, in terms of dealing with the employment status of platform workers, in the EU, there have been a host of kind of policy interventions and initiatives that have tried to address this issue. And we have at least, I would say, at least 3 different strategies. On the one hand, we have, in some member states, have tried to kind of implement what we call a reputable presumption of employment, which is basically a legal presumption that if a worker provides a service to a platform, he or she is presumed employed, but the platform can actually rebut that status. Yeah. This is, for example, the case with the riders law in Spain, which has recently become operational as of August 2021, and it introduces, is one of the first kind of policy instruments that introduces this kind of reputable presumption of employment. Just as a side note, this is very much also a debate that it is taking place at the European level, and the European Commission itself is in the process of designing a regulation for platform workers. We're expecting very soon for the Commission to come up with a regulation that will try to basically address the sort of kind of fragmentation that exists at the moment in terms of legislative approaches across member states. On the other hand, there are in many countries, the employment status has been addressed on a case-by-case basis, and it has been addressed mainly in courts. And courts have used a variety of criteria to basically establish the legal status of the employment status of workers. These criteria include, for example, the level of integration of a worker in the platform organization, the level of autonomy that the worker has, who establishes the market relationship, whether it's the worker or the platform itself, the level of obligation that the worker has to provide services, or whether he or she can engage a substitute, and so on and so forth. So as you can imagine, this kind of approach, well, it can be good in terms of maintaining the kind of the flexibility that the platform work or the platform economy requires, yeah, on a case-by-case basis. But it leads to fragmentation, because different courts can have very different ideas about employment status and can use different criteria, and it also makes it very difficult to assess, who is a worker in the platform economy for regulatory purposes. In addition to this, there's a third kind of category of countries, like, for example, like France or Austria, who have created what we call a third category of employment. So in the European legislation, we have two categories. You're either a worker or self-employed, but at the member state level, there are these third categories, which are called, for example, in France, an auto-entrepreneur, or an employee-like status in Austria. And this also kind of tries to balance the requirement that you always have to have the flexibility that the workers seek in the platform economy, with the need to actually ensure that they have a minimum level of security.
Perfect, thank you. That was very interesting, and it's clear that evidence is needed also to monitor these emerging trends. But now I would move to the area of skills and skills development and invite our third panelist from CEDEFOP. I hope we can have him on the screen. And my question to you, Kostas, would be, what do we know about skills demand in platform work in the European Union? And what do we know also about the worker skills levels? And what's probably very important is also the skills development opportunities that was already touched upon by Ivona.
So, good morning. Thank you very much, Eva, and thank you to Ivona for the very nice study that was carried out in the ETF partner countries. I would like to share with you some insights to respond to your question from an extensive research that CEDEFOP has been carrying out since 2017, focused exactly on the issue of the skills development of platform workers with the so-called crowd-learned studies. So, coming to the first part of your question, which is what do we know about skill demands for in the platform economy? I mean, my instinctive reaction to that is that we have bits and pieces of information, but at the moment, CEDEFOP is trying to build an infrastructure where we will be able to set up a stable European system that will be scraping the various online platforms, trying to gain information, regular and systematic and timely information on what are the type of skills and tasks that are being mostly requested and implemented and carried out in online platforms. So hopefully that we will manage in a couple of years to have a stable system, a dynamic system, similar to what CEDEFOP has developed with regards to understanding what are skill demands in EU labor markets with its OVATE system, its online vacancy analysis tool for Europe. But until we reach at that stage, what we can do and what we have done is to try to follow a survey development approach, where we try to survey some of the major online platforms that exist, such as Upwork and People Per Hour and Freelance, to gain information specifically about the skill development opportunities and the workplace learning that crowd workers carry out. And I think some of the main findings that we saw in this research, which involve both a qualitative and a quantitative element, we have a survey of around 2,000 platform workers, were the following. I guess the first very interesting thing that we always need to put into the context of our discussion is that, you know, referring to a group of people called platform workers can be relatively misleading because there is a wide variety of many different platform workers. This has been shown also by a Eurofound report, which categorized, if I'm not mistaken, more than 10 different forms of platform work. In our case, we focused and zoomed into what you can call crowd work. Namely workers who are working online with digital means. But even there, we made a distinction between what you can call online freelancers and micro workers. So we observed that in platforms such as Upwork and People Per Hour, a significant percentage of people who were engaging in these platforms would consider themselves to be online freelancers. When we asked them, what do you think your main employment status is? Around 60%, for instance, said, I would say I'm a freelancer or an aspiring freelancer. But when we focused on doing our Crowdlearn survey on people from Amazon Mechanical Turk, which is mostly about micro tasks and micro work, obviously the majority of people consider themselves to be employees. A great majority were students who were trying to find ways to do different type of activities, trying to find ways to fill in their time. Even, you know, a lot of them would say, I'm trying to kill my time by doing various things which are related to what I'm learning and studying. So that's the one big conclusion. I think we always need to keep that at the end of our mind, because there are very different implications on skill development and the skills that are demanded for online freelancers, and very different implications for micro workers. The second major conclusion is that even in micro work, let alone in online freelancing, a significant proportion and share of workers do develop their skills, or at least they do feel that they develop their skills. The third major message is, what type of skills do they feel that they develop? Mostly soft skills, transversal skills. So we did observe that platform work entices people to try to be much more thorough in relation to deciding what type of tasks that they should take upon themselves, how much time they should be devoting to specific tasks. They try to become much more organized in the implementation of these tasks. And we do find very, very strongly that basically those platform workers who have a very strong level of self-regulatory capacity, and by self-regulatory capacity, I mean the ability to plan, the ability to reflect about the learning that you're doing by executing the type of platform work that you're doing. These are individuals who manage to do a lot of learning. So a lot of the skills basically are entrepreneurial, assessing the cost benefit of the tasks and the work that you're doing. For online freelancers, there's evidence that they develop their communication skills, but communication skills not in the normal employee manner, where you interact in teams, where you are part of an organization. Communication skills in this case means being able to reach out to potential customers, to clients, to try to attract them, to try to self-brand and sell yourself. So we basically also find that a key problem. Oh, so thank you. You shared the slide also, and we also observed that we also need to make a clear distinction between the skills that you need to have when you're entering into your platform work and the skills that you develop by your platform work. And there we noticed that people who enter into platform work need to already possess a very strong level of basic skills. They already need to have a good level of digital literacy. They already need to have a good level of foreign language skills. But then through their work on the platform, a lot of them develop other foreign language skills, and a lot of them develop the type of skills that I mentioned to you, the organizational, the communication, and the personal dispositions, the ability to pay attention to detail, to try to carry out their tasks more efficiently. I conclude, I think, so for the sake of time, by saying that another big major problem that we observed in the context of the skills of platform workers is the issue of portability, is the issue of recognition of skills, as was also mentioned by Ivona. More than 50% of people in our Crowdlearn survey basically said that they feel locked in to the particular platform with which they are engaging. And they feel that they could not potentially take the knowledge and the experience that they've been gaining through their work that they're doing in one platform to other platforms, let alone to conventional labor markets. So a big part of this has to do with the fact that in the platform economy, people, the accreditation and the signaling of people's skills usually takes place through customer ratings. And also a lot of algorithmic management takes place in how workers manage to utilize their skills so that they can get new tasks and new work. So it's a huge challenge to manage to bring together all of these different skill taxonomies that platforms are using, different ontologies that they're using, different algorithms that they have, which in most cases are very non-transparent, and the different way that customers and clients are rating and providing feedback to workers, to bring all of these together into a harmonized way so that it would be possible to have lots of portability and a common portable platform which would enable workers to have this mobility across platforms and labor markets. So that I conclude by saying that is, I think, what our study also highlighted as being one of the most key challenges for EU policy.
Thank you, Kostas. Very interesting findings, and we can also see similar patterns across many countries, not only in the European Union. But I would still have one question for each of you, because new forms of employment require also policy responses. So at the same time, it's actually a new area, so it may be difficult to understand, let's say, what are the best strategies, measures, but let's try. And I would ask you to be very concise, because we have very little time left. So I would start with Dragos, and my question would be, when it comes to working conditions of platform workers or workers, you know, within these non-standard, let's say, employment, what should national governments focus on to ensure flexibility on the one hand, but also protection of such workers on the other? So in brief, what would be the main takeaways?
Thank you very much. This is a very important question. I'll be extremely brief on this. So I think in Europe, at least, there are two kinds of approaches that have been undertaken by government. First, try to legislate, try to provide a minimum level of social rights to platform workers. And this is, again, for example, the Spanish or the French examples, where, for example, in the case of Spain, the legislation gives certain rights to riders, for example, for even allowing them to know how the algorithm behind the platform is deployed. I think this is a very important part, because it impacts a major source of bias when it comes to platforms. And this is the legislative side. Our work shows that despite the fact that legislative actions are very powerful instruments, they tend to be very narrow in focus, and that tend to be very limited in effectiveness, because they at the moment concern mainly workers who have an employment status, with the exception of Spain, as I said. On the other hand, you can have governments can facilitate more bottom-up approaches, for example, by providing workers with rights regarding collective representation. I think this is one of the important developments that we've seen in Europe in the recent years, the fact that social partners or workers themselves try to organize and try to negotiate on their own their working conditions. I think this is an important lesson, and it's an important mechanism that platform workers can use and can, let's say, apply in improving their working conditions. Thank you.
Thank you. And I would also approach Irene, and I would ask, actually, from her position within ELA, platform work basically doesn't respect boundaries of national states. So what are the implications of these new forms of employment for example, the European Union and the mobility or the digital mobility between countries?
Yeah, thank
Irene?
you. Well, I think in that context, particularly the online platform work is an interesting case, because there we have the potential that we have different countries involved and the worker in a third one. Opportunities that are inherent to that crisis as a result of the COVID pandemic. And we are seeing that there is a lot of unemployment, while on the other hand, we see shortages, notably in occupations related to ICT and technology development, which can be to matching the supply and demand also cross-border. But for that, I think it is important that we really can ensure decent working conditions, that we are not going into a race to the bottom, where then notably your main audience in developing countries, there might be many work opportunities, but at low wage rates, at bad working conditions, so that we are not exploiting the technology to the disadvantage of the workers. And for that, I think it is important that the legislators clarify the concept and the responsibilities, which countries or which regulations would count, what would be the minimum standards, where should social security taxation be paid, at which level. So I think there a kind of a common agreement, and that not only in the EU but beyond would be important.
Thank you, Renée. Very important points. And my last question to Kostas would be actually, looking from the perspective of skills development and also reflecting on your recent work, what would be the main priorities for action and possible solutions to maximize, let's say, the benefits that these new opportunities can bring?
So essentially, in our report, on the basis of all of the findings that we did, we highlighted 4 main pillars of action. The issue of labor market integration, the issue of initial and continuing vocational training, and the skills matching element. I already spoke a little bit about the portability issue. So let me try to focus on 2 additional policies that I think we were highlighting. The first has to do with facilitating the labor market integration of new individuals who are potentially interested in entering into platform economy. Why do we need to consider and implement better policies to facilitate this process? Because our research highlighted very clearly that despite claims that in the platform economy, it's an area where basically you can expand the universe and it can provide opportunities for many people from different backgrounds to enter and work, we did find elements of discriminatory practices, which you can typically see mirrored in the normal labor markets. So for instance, you saw that people who are star performers in particular platforms, they sort of concentrate a lot of the work, whereas new hires struggle sometimes to manage to get new tasks, to manage to build a reputation portfolio that will enable them to do well in their platform career. So we noticed in our data that over 70% said that when they're newcomers and they try to get some tasks in the platform economy, typically clients ask them to complete a small project, almost like a testing project. So we highlighted in our research that, okay, maybe we should be considering trying to formalize this process in the form of a subsidized micro internship. So potentially it could be valuable to consider having a policy which you would be trying to subsidize potential platform clients to hire newcomers, to give them opportunities. But on the other side of the equation, what we need is better feedback. We need feedback from clients that would really enable workers to develop their skills, as opposed to what typically happens now, which is feedback which is not really evaluative. It's not very conducive towards their skill development. So that's one major area of policy. And I conclude by highlighting also that this is going to be a never-ending discussion, in the sense that, the discussion about what you should do in the platform economy about reformulating education training systems is very much tantamount to the issue of how should education training systems adapt themselves. So by looking at how do people work in the platform economy, we understand that they learn digitally, fast, they learn in a very modularized manner, they learn by following bite-sized pieces of videos from YouTube, from interacting with colleagues in platforms such as Stack Overflow. This is, let's call it a new way, a new form of quick and targeted learning. In the case of platform workers, obviously it's more accentuated, because for them, they don't have much time to focus on long training episodes. They need to, whatever time they focus on learning, they lose from earning, from participating in platform projects. But in general, I would say that this discussion has to do with how our continuing vocational training systems would also adapt by trying to offer shorter, more targeted, more focused courses to lifelong learners.
Thank you, Kostas. I think important words, and we see how actually these new trends challenge the way we work, we study. And I would like to thank our panelists for excellent contribution, and would ask also our audience, to share with us in the chat your view on which should be the priorities for action considering these new trends on the labor market. So what are the priorities for action? Please write in the chat your ideas. And now I would pass the floor to Ivona to close the session.
Thank you very much, Eva, and many thanks to our distinguished guests. Really fascinating discussion and very inspiring, I must say. So we also have some of the comments in the chat that have been already somehow also answered by our panelists. I just wanted to refer to this opportunities element. Why actually in the countries that we looked at, we focused our research, ETF partner countries in the Eastern Partnership. Actually, those new developments are seen more as an opportunity. Because on one hand, it might be a fancy and trendy way of work that's very important, in particular for young people and these new communication modes. But then, of course, it's the issue of additional earning, and earning at the level of global practically. So then also there are these opportunities for higher, better earning, either as a primary job, but we are also observing that it's rather as a secondary job. And also the element of informality. What we also see is that maybe in our partner countries, people are less to lose, in the sense that they might have less protection of their work and less benefits. So sometimes they do not even consider themselves informal or working in an informal dimension. Because this part of registration, there is no enough information, there is no maybe such an overlook of taxation, and this is why it's easier to access international job, as I was saying, from our location without even going through asking for a passport, without asking for a work permit in another country or a visa. And those are very important elements that we need to think in this international context, because there are no borders for some of those types of work. But with this reflection, let me now conclude our session. We will definitely continue those exchanges and sharing of practices, and maybe also some additional thoughts on how to gather better evidence and to direct policies on the new methodological approaches to this, to collect this evidence that would be comparable at the international level, because we were pointing to many differences as well, but many similarities. And just one point from ETF, we will be soon launching a further exploration in our partner countries, in the 6 Western Balkan countries. that we will be bringing the elements of the new trends for the reflection on implication for example, youth-related policies. And with this, I would like to thank you very much, our guests, Eva and you that are joining us to the webinar. And I would like to invite for a 5-minute break. So it's now 10:45. So let's meet again at 10:50 for another very interesting session that will look at the new trends from the inclusiveness perspective, and in particular on the gender dimension. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ismaël, vous m'entendez?
Bonjour, oui, je suis là.
Oui, on peut tester Gohan.
Enchanté, Graham. Ouais.
Gohan, can you tell us if Ismail's microphone works well?
Vous m'entendez clairement?
Je vous entends. Vous pouvez aussi allumer le vidéo pour
Oui,
vous voir aussi.
Ah, voilà. Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Oui, ça va bien. Je pense que tout va bien, mais je n'ai pas le OK de Gohan.
De Gohan.
marche? Ok. Allô? Parfait. Good.
I hope most of the participants you are back to this session too, and that you had a nice coffee or tea. In April 2020, just a couple of months to the pandemic in Europe, 67% of the health personnel in Italy and 72% of the health workers in Spain infected by COVID-19 were women. At the peak of the pandemic, over 1.5 billion learners were out of the school, and UNESCO estimated that about 11 million girls, especially in the developing countries, and teenage girls would not return to school. Finally, the World Economic Forum Global Gender Equality report of 21 estimates that pandemic has actually added a whole generation to the time it takes to achieve gender equality globally. Projected on the previous time series, it was about 100 years, and now it would take at least 137 years. These are some gendered impacts of COVID. Today, we're going to look at the impact of COVID-19 on women's employment. My name is Outi Kärkkäinen. I work at the European Training Foundation, and I'm the facilitator of this session too. Welcome to everybody. We will be running this session quite smoothly with a quite high speed. And I apologize already now to the speakers and panelists if I need to interrupt you. It's purely for time management reasons. And participants, if you have questions, like said previously, please post them in the chat and we will try to answer them at the end of the session. I would like to now, to start with, launch a poll. So the global shortfall of jobs in 2020 relative to 2019, so compared to the 2019 figures, is 54 million, 94 million, or 144 million jobs. Let's take about 30 seconds to answer the question. Be brave, guess. Okay. Let's close the poll and see the results. Okay, this is very interesting. 54 million, 19% of the respondents, 94 million, 47, and 144 million jobs, 35. So the majority, not the majority, but almost half chose the option B, 94 million. I would now like to give the floor to our key speaker, Kristina from the International Labour Organization, team lead for Skills for Social Inclusion. She will talk about the global trends and challenges of gender responsive recovery and employment. Christine, could you also enlighten us on the correct response to the poll? The floor is yours.
With pleasure. Thank you so much, Uti. And good morning to everyone. A great pleasure to be here with you and to see so much collaboration as well between ILO and ETF. We've had a career guidance seminar yesterday, so maybe some of you also participated in this one. So I will be talking about the gendered effects of the pandemic, about the role of labor market policies to cushion the effects, about policy priorities to build forward fairer, and give you some country examples from outside the sort of ETF countries. So not to stretch your patience too much, this chart should give you the response, so you can look for it. And it shows you how the employment rate has changed over the last 15 years, and you can see the clear drop for both men and women in 2019-20. The share for women of the employment rate has dropped further, but because the female employment rate is lower than the male, in total numbers, we have around 54 million jobs for women and 60 million jobs for men lost. But if you make the calculation, we're not yet at 144, which is the right number, but because this also includes the 30 million jobs that were not created in this year. So that's overall the shortfall. So this chart has been released yesterday. So it's very fresh off the press. And it comes from the 8th COVID monitor that the ILO...
Sorry, can I interrupt you? Do you manage to put the full screen for the presentation? I'm not sure.
You can't see it in full screen?
No.
I have it in full screen, actually. Well, I can stop sharing and try again.
We see also the next slide. Maybe you have to...
Let's try again. It's okay, we have time.
Yeah, sorry for that.
Okay, now we see the slide. If we put it on the, okay, let's see. It should work. Let's see. It's taking some time.
Yeah. Sorry for that. If not, maybe it's easier if you share them and I just continue talking. You have the slides as well.
Can you try
that issue before? I'm really sorry. Yeah.
You should change the display setting. The message saying you should change display setting. I don't know what it means.
I will kindly ask our contractor to share the presentation of Christine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'll just explain what you are seeing on the next slide. So as I said, this was released yesterday. It's the 8th COVID monitor. And it basically shows that against sort of everyone's hopes, the situation in 2021 is not getting better globally. It is when we look at high-income countries, but already for middle-income countries, it's not. And for low-income countries that did not have the resources to cushion the effects of the crisis, the situation is still very bad. And what you can also see in the slide is that the group most affected are young women across all 5 sort of quarters displayed from 2020 to 2021.
Sorry, Christine, I'm just saying if...
Yeah, I'm still not seeing the screen, right?
The slides, if they could share them. We have given you the PowerPoint, so...
I will share the screen, no problem. I have it here.
Sorry, Christine, for this.
Okay, no, I'm sorry.
Happens.
Yeah, there really seems to be something about my settings. Sometimes it works and sometimes you... So you've seen the black one, right?
No, sorry.
Yeah, I think now it's coming.
Sorry, it's not. No, it's not the right one. Sorry. It's not. Okay. Can you see it now?
Yeah, but it's not the right one.
It's not the right one. Not the right one.
I mean, basically, I can continue and we'll look at the slide with the chart afterwards. So the COVID-19 crisis, as also your figures, Uti, that you gave, showed very clearly, has disproportionately affected women. Yes, so this is the slide, so you can see in the middle, young women, 15 to 24 years old, have really suffered most, and their employment sort of losses are still greatest. So next slide, please. Also in the second quarter in 2021. So why were women overly affected? It's because they were overrepresented in certain sectors, in those sectors that were more impacted, but also because their share of informal employment was higher in those sectors. Also because many of the high wage jobs that were able to move to full-time telework were held by men and not by women. We've also seen that the additional burden of unpaid care work, so either taking care of sick family members or looking after the kids that were not able to go to school or to training centers, were so that care burden was taken on by women, also with repercussions for their physical and mental health. We also know that women already pre-pandemic have had lower levels of access to social protection, and there's one point actually missing on the slide, that there's an increase in violence and harassment as well for women. So that also seems to have played a role in them being able to keep their jobs at lesser rates. Next slide, please. Another factor is the digitization. And while many services, including training, have moved to digital provision, also there we can see that women, in particular, if households only have one device, were disadvantaged or continue to be disadvantaged. Women from vulnerable backgrounds, including in high-income countries, face difficulties to use the services, employment services, for example, that are offered digitally, as some of our recent briefs as well confirm. Next slide, please. And also, as we all know, inequalities in employment start in education and training. So we do have segregated enrollments in TVET. We have lower participation of women, in particular in rural and informal economies globally, and in particular in lower and middle income countries. So occupational choices remain gender biased, and women are overrepresented in those specialities that lead to lower productivity and lower paying jobs. And there's also enough evidence that dropout rates of women are higher in those male-dominated training programs when they join. So all of this leads to the gender pay gap, which still stands at 19% globally. We don't have figures now yet how this has changed after the pandemic, but it's very likely to have gone up. It only shrunk 2 percentage points in the last 3 decades. Next slide, please. So you will see 5 further effects that can lead to really long-lasting inequalities in the labor market for women. The first one being that gender, throughout all past crises, has shown to be a rationing mechanism. So if jobs are lost, they have a higher likelihood of affecting women first. There's also a risk that women are pushed further into precarious employment, that their unpaid care work, this already existing burden, increases further. There's also risk, and we've also seen that in some countries, that women are left behind in sectoral recovery policies because they often, or they might focus on male-dominated sectors and trades. And we have also seen globally that there's a higher risk of child labor, especially of young women. So if households lose income, children from poor families might not go back to school or into training. And we have seen that the downward trend of child labor globally has been reversed for the first time this year because of the pandemic. Next slide, please. So what's the role of labor market policies? I mean, clearly this is what we are talking about. We have seen in developing countries a focus on income support, and in advanced economies on social protection schemes, unemployment benefits, but also a lot of active labor market policies to deal with redundancies, furloughs, reduced work schemes, to preserve jobs and skills, facilitate employment and keep people connected to the labor market. So we have seen that during the pandemic, women fared better in those countries that took measures to prevent them from losing their jobs, and employment retention benefits have played a very important role for this. Next slide, please. So there are 6 recommendations I'd like to leave you with to build forward fairer. So the first is to integrate gender concerns into any new or ongoing skills and employment policies and measures. And in order to do that well, you need to understand what men's and women's distinctive barriers to skills and jobs are in the crisis situation. Macroeconomic stimulus packages, very important. They need to continue to boost aggregate demand, but in a way that it benefits women's employment and the sectors where they work and their incomes. So we also certainly need to promote inclusive skills and lifelong learning in all sectors, technology-intensive fields for women, and in social and care work for men, to balance this occupational segregation and to reach a state where we have more equal pay for work of equal value. And active labor market policies clearly play a very important role, including recognition of prior learning, counseling, mentoring, and promoting positive role models as well. And last but not least, I also can't see it on the slide, but it is on it. It's the investment in care services. Not only to facilitate labor market participation of women, but also to create additional jobs, and to create additional jobs, including for male care workers. The last slide has a couple of examples from countries outside of the ETF countries. Argentina and Botswana, for example, have provided wage subsidies, Colombia and Chile as well, for new hires with greater subsidies for women. So these are measures for the formal sector. In Mexico and Kenya, for example, and several other countries, public employment programs were established, sometimes also with quotas for women that provide some direct income support, also for people in the informal economy. Colombia and Senegal have created or strengthened support for women entrepreneurs, again, a measure valid for informal workers. And in Korea, for example, where the public employment service is very well established, they've worked particularly through occupational centers for women to link job search with special maternity leave allowances and childcare subsidies. So thank you very much for your attention, but most importantly for trying to integrate all these measures in your current and future policies to build forward fairer? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christine. It was very interesting, and it was also interesting to see the measures at the end that you mentioned. What we have seen, I think that the measures have been quite a lot of short-term kind, tackling the crisis situation. I mean, I take just the closest example. In Italy, for example, to have the subsidy for babysitters during the COVID lockdown. I looked at the, just to comment on your presentation, I looked at the latest COVID monitor of ILO, and actually it was quite depressing to see that the job losses have not recovered, that we're still talking about 130 or even 140 million job losses. So even though in some countries in Europe we see a recovery, globally this is not the case yet. And we don't know yet the exact figures and the difference regarding the recovery for women, and comparing women to men, who has lost the most and who is recovering the best. We will probably know that later on with more statistics available around the world, because there are a lot of regional differences also in the world. But I think there is an overall understanding that the impact of COVID has been more negative on the employment levels of women, maybe with the exception of Saudi Arabia, where for different reasons, for reforms and because of sending back the migrants, women had to women were invited to enter the labor market more. But thanks again, Christine. I would now like to launch the second poll, please. So if we take the wage of a man in formal employment, these are world averages, of course, as 100%, the male counterpart in the woman in formal wage employment earns on average 79% compared to this 100% of the male, a man working in formal wage employment. There is a mistake in the question. I don't know how can I ask the question. So what the ILO has calculated is that the man, compared to this 100% of informal wage employment, the man in informal wage employment earns the equivalent of 66%. So this is missing in the question. So we have, I repeat, 100% male formal wage employment, 79% female formal wage employment. We have 66% male informal employment. What do you think is are the earnings of female informal employment as a percentage of the wage of a man in formal employment? I give a full 30 seconds because the question is a bit complicated. We will see a figure then in a second. Okay, let's close the poll and have a look at the results. I'm happy you got the question, even if there was a mistake in how it was formulated. So 33 of 1/3 thinks it's up 57%. 24 1/4 thinks it's about 47 and 43. So let's say the answer C got most of the votes. I will now share the screen, my screen, to show you the results. And I would kindly like to ask Christine still to comment on the results and the graphic, which is quite interesting, and it comes from the ILO recent report. Please, Christine.
Yeah, thank you very much, Uti, indeed. So you can see the world average in red, and hence the share of women in informal employment amount to 47% of what a man earns in formal employment. And you can see that in the developed world, actually men in informal employment earn more compared to in the other regions. But you can also see, in the developed, but you can also see that in the developing world, women in informal employment even earn less. So I think we're at 25% or so of what a man in formal employment earns. So the wage gap there really is considerably larger if we include the gender and the informal and formal dimension when we look at the wage gap.
Thank you very much, Christine. We shall now move to the second part of the session, where we will be looking and reflecting some examples of projects, programs, policies to promote women's employment. And we have panelists from Austria, Armenia, and Morocco. So welcome Julian Hebel from the Austrian Public Employment Service, Director General International Affairs Office. Welcome Gohar Vardanyan from Women Rights House, Armenia. I can't see Gohar, I hope you are online.
I'm here, Oti. Thank you very much for presentation.
And welcome Ismail Iftisen from Entreprise Sociale Maroc. If we now look at the EU, there was a recent study by European Network of Public Employment Services that covers the public employment service of the EU member states, plus the EFTA countries, and Commission is also part of a member of the network. They had a survey and study in 2020 looking at gender approaches of EU public employment services. And some of the findings of the study is that in most of the cases, there's no overreaching strategy to tackle gender equality in the public employment services and the policies. And in even a limited number of European public employment services mainstream gender in their policy, in employment strategy. And very few have a specific gender-sensitive procedures regarding the customer contact, fighting stereotypes, and being not only gender neutral, but also gender sensitive and responsive or transformative, and very few even deliver gender awareness courses to their staff. And what is the network has adopted gender equality as a new objective, and it's seen as an opportunity for a common EU model for best intervention in the policy areas of gender within the EU. So my question to you, Julian, is what can a public employment service do for promoting women's labor market integration based on your experience in Austria. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Uti, and your colleague. Thank you very much for the invitation. I hope you can hear me loud and clearly. That's perfect. I will try to be brief and meet the 5-minute challenge that we have here in the panel. I think, first of all, there is 2 general remarks I would like to do. There is 2 general important elements that we have observed in Austria that the PES can do. And the first one is awareness internally that women are a special target group, so that they deserve a specialized service. And we are doing this since almost no more than 3 decades, actually 33 years. We started with women counseling and programming here. And the second one is, of course, a financial commitment. And in terms of this financial commitment, we have, even if we have less unemployed women in our register, we decided to spend at least 50%, and we are now discussing even 54% of our budget for active labor market measure policies on women. So these 2 basic elements that we have. We have heard already that there is a lot of international and national legislation on female labor market participation, and this translates, of course, also into our own legislative framework of the Public Employment Service, and then translates into, I think, three strategic elements or axes. And the first one is to increase the employment rate of women. Why? Because we have, in terms of a shrinking workforce, in terms of the demographic change, 2 opportunities to compensate and to stabilize. This is the female labor market participation first, and the migration aspect. The second of these 3 strategic axes is the decrease of the employment rate of women, and to secure a stable and independent income. And the third one is to guarantee an equal access of women for professions in Austria, and to contribute to the closing of the gender pay gap, which is in Austria still relatively high. It amounts up to 18.5% as far as I've seen in the latest figures. So how do these 3 strategic axes then translate into action, into our PES? I would like to differentiate between first the counseling part and then second one into the qualification part. When we come to the counseling part, I think the first important aspect already starts prior to the Public Employment Service intervention, which is information provision to young girls and boys when they are still in school. So we have set up a cooperation with the education system. And there is a mandatory visit within the law that those young pupils in the last year of their mandatory school year, which is 14 to 15 years old, so it's the year before they take their first professional decision, they have to mandatory visit at least once an information center. This is dedicated information centers within our PES at AMS. So there they get information, and they can choose some professions and test their skills and capabilities, and inform about what is their future choices. When it comes to the intervention scenario done at the Public Employment Services, since 1995, we have dedicated counselors. We call them reintegration counselors, which are trained especially for mothers but also fathers, but in reality it's more than 90% young women. So after maternity leave, if they are aiming of reintegrating into the labor market, how is this reintegrators defined? It's those that have not had a job since 1 year, so 365 days, once their or maternity allowances, the benefits have ended. And to this end, we have established a cooperation with the health insurance system, because the health insurance system in Austria is the institution that pays out these benefits. So since the benefits end, every young mother and a father are receiving information and some contact details within the Public Employment Service where they can turn to and where they can get information for a possible reintegration into the labor market. So what do they receive by these dedicated counselors? It's of course in-depth counseling services. There is a possibility to also get an allowance for childcare. For example, if a person is going to go for a job interview, you can train job interviews, you can get orientation information, you can have a small qualification measure if there is a need be, you can test and do some employability analysis and so on. So usually we have such reintegration managers, counselors in all of our local offices, but on top we have also in all of the 9 regions at least one dedicated job information center for women, where they can also get this case management, in-depth analysis, orientation measures. So this is for the part of the counseling part. And when it comes to the qualification measures, qualification part, I would like to point out one qualification measures, which is called Women in Crafts and Techniques. This is a comprehensive, or if you wish, so a holistic program. These programs have turned out to be those which are the most successful ones. Of course, they are also the most expensive ones. And why do we offer this? We have seen already when I talked about this provision for young girls and boys still in school, that there is still a very traditional pattern of professional choices in Austria. So there, for a long time, the young girls desired to become hairdressers, and the boys prefer to become car mechanics. And of course, these choices in turn have very different wage levels. So usually a hairdresser earns much less than a car mechanics. And so these patterns of the gender pay gap already starts at this stage. And to this end, we have created this comprehensive package here for women that want to work in either crafts or techniques. And what does it consist of? So we start with an orientation measure again, so counseling, in-depth case management, and an analysis of the capabilities and the skills of this person. And once they have decided to continue with this program, we can have first a small training session where they can test their abilities. And again, once they pass this, we can offer an intense training, which has at least an apprenticeship formal qualification, or even a tertiary education. So these are courses that last usually longer than 1, 2, 3, or even 4 years, which are of course quite cost intense. Over these periods, we offer also a kind of a mentoring system to accompany these women. And even afterwards, we continue to support them with job search, and then even a post-placement service that is provided together with. And on top, we can also then offer some other subsidies, such as the childcare subsidy that I've already mentioned, which provide a financial subsidy in case for job interviews or in case of programming testing period of these qualifications. So this, in short, I hope I met the 5 minutes, is the intervention scenario that we offer. There is also other programs which are dedicated for women, but I think these are in short the most important ones.
Thank you, Julian. I think it's very important that you highlighted these gender-specific or gender-targeted measures like the information center for women in each region, which is quite courageous as a policy. If people have further questions to Julian about practical things and how things have worked in real life, there is also a document posted in the chat where you can find Julian's email address also if you have further questions. We move from Austria. Gohar, according to the World Bank, in 2019, about 1/4 of the Armenian population lived under the poverty line, and at some moment of the pandemic, the same bank estimated that Almost a quarter of the Armenian population, 720,000 people out of the barely 3 million people, would actually move downward in mobility to another welfare category due to the pandemic and the context. Women's activity rates reach hardly 50%, and your organization works in the Shirak region, situated in the northwest, bordering Georgia and Turkey. And it's a region which is among the poorest provinces of Armenia. So in this context, my question to you is, what can a grassroots level organization like yours to promote women's labor market integration? And in particular, how do you reach out to women who have lost their jobs due to the pandemic? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Oti, very much. I'm Kohar, as you already presented, and it's very great pleasure for me to be here. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Yes.
Okay. At first, I want to mention that during the last 1 year, our organization implemented various projects for women and girls from the Shirak region. And thanks to these economic empowerment projects, 117 women acquired business skills, 87 of which learned new professions, and 54 women and girls are now working in their new professions during those economic empowerment projects. 37 people of 55 were provided with professional tools based on need assessment in order to be able to in a new profession and gain financial independence. Besides, thanks to the support conducted by the Women's Rights House social worker, 19 people received assistance in writing competitive CVs and job research, out of which 16 are now working. We also provided legal, social, and psychological free assistance to all those women and girls who needed it, and we always assisted them. One of the most important projects that we have implemented is in the framework of EU COVID-19 Solidarity Program for Eastern Partnership and financed by people in need. This project was a fight against COVID-19 through the promotion of women's entrepreneurship. As many women and girls and their families lost their jobs and incomes, this project came to support women's economic empowerment and to help them to gain financial independence. The target group of our project were women and girls from the Shirak region who lost their jobs because of COVID-19 or have no income and have also certain skills. And to ensure greater outreach and to inform those who didn't have access to internet, announcements have been spread in various NGOs and active groups, also in organizations' Facebook page. At the end of those selection process, 30 women were selected, and they applied individually or in groups, and for all of them, 8 capacity building courses were conducted by experienced business professionals, and women learned some business management, marketing, about tax legislation, about competitive ones, and also all participants who participated in capacity building courses and represented prospective business ideas were selected and received up to 700,000 AMD to start their own businesses in the Shirak region. 13 business projects were selected, but as the time is short, I will speak about a few of of them. You can see here the chosen business ideas. They are all innovative and interesting ones that we don't have mostly in our region. For example, the most important one is this project from Kohar and Tamara, who created an innovative sewing workshop in different villages. They are establishing baby beddings, also other things, and they are working from their houses, which were in two different villages, and but this is one total project which promotes women's entrepreneurship and their financial independence, and this is some of their production. Another project which is again important one is a project of Susanna, who is creating crafted products, and she tries to encourage as ecological as possible, and also appreciating culture and history. So she also make photos by her own, and she uses it in her own bags and other accessories. Photos from Gyumri and from Chirac. Another participant of this project is Hripsik, who likes beekeeping, and we also encourage to not only young women and girls, but also those who are in retirement age. And she has 10 years of experience in beekeeping and 20 bee families. And due to the project, she started to do more products from bee, and now she has a great amount of sales. Her honey is now in different shops of the Chirac region, and also she do online sales. Another project is Anne's project, who created Child Development Entertainment Center in Gyumri, one of the districts where there is no such place in that district, and children couldn't go there to learn more and to spend their time. And this is a great opportunity for that children in that district to have their own space for entertainment and development. The name is Lego. And the other innovative project which I want to introduce is a project of Zina. She produced mushrooms in the basement of her own house. She has 2 little children and couldn't work from workplaces, and this project gave her an opportunity to work from home and to earn money even from home by giving such interesting products which we doesn't have in our city. Now this is, and in shops, and she is selling from home again. So as an investment by the organization, I want also to mention about the exhibition sale, which we have organized for our participants. And okay.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. We have to move on with the time. Thank you very much for these examples of grassroots level innovative initiatives by an NGO. So after a public employment service, an NGO, we moved to Morocco, to Ismail. The border closures, especially towards Spain, and lockdown measures had a drastic effect on women's employment in Morocco. And the situation is challenging also because of the very large informal sector and the high level of analphabetism, especially among women. So the context is very challenging. Could you briefly explain in your organization, as you have witnessed the intersectionality of these gender and socioeconomic disadvantage, how you have supported women, and especially maybe the case of supporting women in entrepreneurship and in a new status which cannot be found in many countries in the world currently. Thank you, Ismail. The floor is yours.
شكرا. شكرا. أنا جد سعيد بتواجدي معكم وأشكر بالخصوص.
I'm so happy to be with you.
على الاستضافة لمشاركة تجربة منظمتنا في كل ما يتعلق بتمكين النساء.
And I would like to thank you for giving us the chance to speak about this in Morocco. And I hope that this is going to be a good addition to this session. In our organization, we are a Moroccan organization, and I will give you an overview about us and the activities which we conduct. After that, I will be speaking about how we could, as an organization of being ahead of and helping those women, this marginalized group, which we have, and it's one of the targeted groups of the organization. I will share now my screen with you.
Just to remind Ismail, you have 5 minutes, so.
Can you see my screen now? The Social Entrepreneurship Organization our organization in Morocco is an organization which is non-governmental, which has been established in 2017. This organization is an incubator of social enterprise, which is also has a partnership, which is an Solitaire, the Italian organization. The centers we have a number of offices or windows, actually, which help those this group of people, amongst of which the women who are in difficult situation. We have the directions and information, the entrepreneur office, and this is for people who have the individual projects, and then the office of the NGOs, which work on the capacity building of others. And then we have also the office for people who are looking for jobs, and then the office of the people who have organizations starting with 3 people, and then the office of providing IT information and training. This is to improve the skills of those people. And not to be long here, we have not to be long in regard to what my colleague Oti had said. There are a number of difficulties in regard to women. That is why we need to have an initiative to have the women be part of the labor market, and to be part, and to do that we want them to be part of the entrepreneurship world, and this is going to be done through improving their abilities in regard to establishing income jobs or activities. In addition to this, we have COVID-19, which have increased the difficulties which those women face. Nonetheless, the entrepreneurship system is a new system which has been started in 2015, has a number of difficulties or challenges. Why? Because people don't know about this issue. Second, there is a lack of organizations which work in directing people towards entrepreneurship. This is why, as an organizations, we try to cover this lacking, and we are doing this in LAC and Kunaitra. Those are the areas in the middle area of Morocco. as well as Tanja, Tetuan, Al Hoceima, which are in the northern areas of Morocco. In regard to the percentage of the women benefiting from the services we provide, the women who have used this donations are supporting 27%. The women who have benefited from the consultation in regard to establishing their own entrepreneurship program or a project and to make this successful were about 56%. And this is the women who have used the also service of raising the awareness is 46%. Now, in regard to the stages, first, how we support women. First, we train and we raise the awareness. We consult and coach. Third, we help them in the legal issues in getting the card of entrepreneur. And this card enables the women of being entrepreneurs legally in this within the system, and this would give a structure to her own activity as well. This would enable the woman of giving invoices, and this would make the woman capable of having customers in the formal sector, the institutions, the companies, and this is something which was not possible for them before. Getting this card of entrepreneurship as well, what we do, we support the women through giving some donations or money or funds which enable the women of increasing the income they have from the activities they're conducting. And as well, we provide training courses and improving their skills. What we do, we have a number of workshops which can be presented in a number of fields, for example, coiffure, sewing, anything which is related to hotels and hospitality. And those are amongst the things which are usually provided. And we have presented a number of courses to a big group of women in this regard. And through this, we could enable them to go through the crisis of COVID safely. As well, we also did something else in regard to the digital issues, the digital marketing issue. We have helped them with this so that we can participate in a big manner in allowing a big number of women to market their products and their services, and this allowed them to be able to get more customers, especially during COVID time, in of course, a very easy manner.
You have 1 minute left, sorry.
There are as well other programs which are related to groups of people or group of women, which who are this is like cooperatives of 3 people and or 5 people. We have also accompanied them in their work in establishing those cooperatives. So those women are working in, for example, beekeeping, honey production, also in nail raising, and also in also producing mushroom as well. And this is done through coaching them, and this is done throughout 3 years. Usually, we could help these women to establish their cooperatives, and this could help them face the difficulties they have, and this empowered them of new techniques in their fields of work, and this had made it easier for them to face all the challenges. Thank you very much. I apologize for being long.
Thank you very much, Ismaila. Thank you for the translators. trying to follow you talking in the marathon. It was not completely clear from the translation for me, but one of the points was that you're working on this status, which is called entrepreneur autonome. So autonomous entrepreneur, which is the first step between informal employment and becoming an entrepreneur. And this is an innovative aspect in your work and in Morocco overall. I would like to thank everybody for your attention, the panelists, speakers, and participants for your attention, for your contribution, and for your ideas and enthusiasm in the presentations. I will now pass the floor to my colleague, Christina.
Thank you, Oti, and many thanks to your excellent contributors, also to those in the session 1, because actually they helped us to set the scene for the last session. The last session is looking into the labor market and skills information and the challenges, the additional needs we have in terms of information. And we also saw, particularly in the last session, that also the landscape of employment and skills providers is changing fast in our countries, and therefore data and information system monitoring and evaluation procedures should try to capture these changes. The session I will moderate together with my colleague Doriana Monteleone, who is a statistician in the European Training Foundation. And we are really grateful to have 3 panelists, 3 contributors to our event coming from a varied background, let's say. We have Enod Jela from Albania, representing the UNDP Albania and working together with public institutions and other stakeholders in Albania on improving the labor market information system. Then we will also have Ms. Nora Condon from the Further Education and Training Authority in Ireland. She will also contribute on the past changes and reforms they have performed in the context of pandemic. And finally, we will have as discussant Daniela Zampini, representing the International Labour Office, the regional office for Central and Eastern Europe. So with many thanks for your availability to join and also to still remain with us after this marathon. I pass the floor now to Doriana, but before that, just to say one point. We picked this topic as in response to your feedback. Back on 28th of April, we had our previous event, and one of the issues that you raised in terms of challenges, insufficient information and so on, it was exactly this point. The volatile labor market context in our countries, particularly in the EU neighborhood and Central Asia, and the difficulties to capture all these changes. So that's why we are now focusing on these topics. Doriana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christina. Now we are going to have our last poll. So let's see on our screen the question, and let's read it together. So according to your experience, what's the most challenging aspect in setting up a labor market and skills information system in your country? You can choose one of the following answers. Limited capacity to collect, process, and analyze relevant and reliable information, inadequate resources for statistics development and other activities aimed at generating new information, underdeveloped institutional capacity to coordinate data generation, use and dissemination, lack of adequate means, platforms, networks to disseminate information. Also, in this case, you have a few seconds to choose your answer. So let's please vote this last poll. So we are talking about capacity. We are talking about resources. We are talking about institutional capacity and also means for dissemination. Let's wait still a few seconds. Okay, can we stop the voting, please? And let's check together the answers. Okay, the results of this poll, again, is not, one direction, let's say, because it seems that the limited capacity to collect and process and analyze information, as well as the underdeveloped institutional capacity to coordinate, are the most challenging steps of the process. While the resources for statistic development and the means for dissemination seems to be the less problematic aspects. So thank you for your active contribution to this last poll. And please let me introduce our first speaker, Angela, who will share the Albanian experience on building information basis for ALMPs design. Anna, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity of talking to you today about our experience in Albania. I work as a program officer with the UNDP country office in Albania, and I've been working in the field of employment and skills for quite a decade now. I particularly sort of like as a parenthesis, I particularly like the poll, and I imagine myself through that poll during my 20 years of experience at UNDP here, where myself 20 years ago would have gone with the first sort of like option. Right now, when we started with UNDP, there were so few data available around the country with statistics, and I see Daniela's nodding. And right now, we have gone 20 years, fast forward 20 years. I mean, we have quite a few sources of data available that, the struggle is basically to coordinate their generation and actually make good use of them. So this is actually our starting point, and I'm going to start sharing the screen here, if that's okay, for the presentation. I don't know if anyone can see right now. Yeah.
Yes.
Can you see? Yeah. Okay. So basically,
put in a slideshow.
It's in a slideshow. Okay. Should be okay now. Okay. So basically, we when the pandemic sort of like started, we sort of like got our heads together and thought, what is there anything to do in terms of like helping the situation that we had in the country. And we had, the idea of having a labor market system, information system, as it were. We had thought about it a long time, sort of like with very limited success. And when the pandemic started, basically we sort of like started to get used, and in coordination with our government counterparts, we started to actually see the data and monitor. It was basically an organic need to see how the pandemic was evolving in the country in terms of the labor market. So we had, by that time, we had already sort of like gone into a bit of a let's say a review of the sources of information in the country and what could be done. And we had just basically started to think about establishing what we call this labor market observatory. And we had done we had a consultant working with us and getting some international practices. And we basically were ready to sort of start the process of at least getting some information and data analyzed. And then the pandemic struck. And what we sort of started producing was data briefs, very sort of concise pagers, 2 pages of data briefs, getting the information from various sources, including, mostly from the Ministry of Finance, but also from other statistics sources, including the LFS and statistics and the National Employment Agency, sort of like to get a sort of like good grasp of the reality. In hindsight, I have to say that in Albania we do have with coordination with the EU, there's a policy group that is called the Integrated Policy Management Group that oversees policy reforms in certain sectors in the government with strong sort of like donor participation. And in Albania, there's a very sort of like successful case of IPMG on employment and skills. Where basically all the challenges, all the milestones of reform are presented and discussed among many stakeholders. So sort of like we came from a systemic angle into this analysis of ours. So basically, we started to think, this is a snapshot of basically what was the end result. The idea was to ensure supply-driven, individualized ALMPs, get like new ALMPs designed in response to the needs of the pandemic, and also get a bit of like diversification on the ALMPs, as we in this country, they have been sort of like pretty sort of like standard during the years, and including the targeting procedures. So you see there is like we have the 5 LMPs that were approved, while 3 of them are sort of like standard they have been in the past. I think there are 2 new. There are 2 new ones that were approved with our help: the self-employment and the community employment. We're just trying to sort of like describe the process, how this happened. Basically, we actually analyzed various data that we had. We worked on signals. We looked at the various variables like gender, age groups, experience, occupations, regions, economic sectors, and then the whole process led to the finalization of those 5 ALMPs that I just mentioned. In sort of like in details, so what we did, we were tracking together with our government partners, tracking on weekly and monthly basis the performance of labor market in general, and then we were able to look into the specific sectors. On the other hand, we also looked at the performance of employment in these sectors. And we found out that these insights that we were looking at actually highlighted that service and garment industry were the most affected economic sectors in the country. And then by looking at the age groups, we saw that the young people and basically were mostly affected, explained by the fact that the highest rate of employment due to sort of like tourism, where we have a lot of like exposure of young people to the tourism season, and then the age 55 plus, lowest paid people, informal workers and females were sort of like particularly affected. And then, obviously, we looked into these. The main underline was the employees of the services and elementary professions were the most unemployment, the highest amount of job losses in the pandemic. So this is what we basically analyzed on a continuous basis. I must say that we were able to provide and we were able to share these briefs with our partners, or it was basically very much appreciated. And in the end, we finalized this research and this work on this data probing, which I have to say we were sort of like we at UNDP are paying quite a bit of attention to the new sort of like data that are becoming available, sort of capacities at UNDP are being enriched, not in the headquarters, regional offices, but also in our country with people that actually can work on data. Data science is becoming a big thing, and obviously with the limitations that we do have in a small country, a small market, I think this is something that it can be widely used for policy making purposes beyond the traditional sort of like evidence policy making that we have worked in the past. So basically, we've completed the circle with decisions of the Council of Ministers, where the budget of the state budget was allocated with the program duration of 4 to 12 months. I think I'm not, you can see here basically what the ALMPs were about. There were several sort of like stratas, like with 4 months, 8 months, and 12 months, and definitions about the beneficiaries and those that actually were affected by COVID. This is a snapshot of the data that we were producing during the year. That we basically distributed and made use of all graphics and infographics, and we were also able to include some interesting data that were coming from internet resources, from like AdWords, and what jobs were being published online, what people were looking online in terms of Google about job opportunities. So I mean, this is like a new strata of data that obviously is not very scientific, but still, it can help to actually complete the picture. So basically, our approach, giving some sort of like the experience of all these years of work coming from the development of a statistics system and opening up into the real-time data sort of like revolution. I think, there's much more that needs to be done, and we can be done with the data that are being produced and sort of like probed. Obviously, I mentioned the capabilities that I think the data work with data is becoming a big thing in the international organizations as well, and data literacy is sort of like becoming important all across our work, but also trying to get that into our government partners. Obviously, we are also aware about the data limitations and the gaps and the risks and certain issues about blind spots and negative implications. Obviously, we are very much aware of those. And at this stage, what we are currently doing, we are sort of like starting the work with the new administration of the Ministry of Finance to get this labor market observatory up and running, and enrich that into a bit of sort of like what we have been working, what we can actually call the economic development tracker. Obviously, there's a lot of work here in Albania. Albania has been affected by 2 major shocks. Before the pandemic, there was also an earthquake at the end of November 2019, that sort of like both these 2, let's say, shocks are sort of like affecting the entire policy making and the public investment scheme in the country. And there's even talk about the third crisis, about the energy crisis that actually, is affecting in countries in Europe at least. So this is where we are actually trying to analyze the functionalities of data and try to make sense of this data, and make sure to have those briefs that I showed you that UNDP produced, to have them, let's say, in the capacities of the government, which we are trying currently to establish a policy research unit at the Ministry of Finance that actually can look into the labor market, but also economic recovery data and indicators. I mean, these are the data principles that we've been trying to sort of like, we abide by UNDP. Obviously, the key message here that you can probe into data, but I think personal data is a very important aspect that needs to be guarded, and also ethical sort of like discussions about it. So I mean, these are the underlying principles of our work. But as a process, and I'm gonna, I think there's another one. Okay. Basically, this is the what I presented in one just single PowerPoint page. So basically, you go through the impact assessment, which I forgot to mention, about previous ones that we had done. We worked on the analysis of the current and potential client base by looking at the data, the employment services, and also the data of the coming up from the SILC or the LFS. Looking to the experiences of other countries in the EU and the work that has been taking place. I mean, we have been sort of like opening up our government partners to experiences in the European EU countries, like such as Ireland. We have worked on the reformation of the ALMPs and shared them, consulted with them. We completed a legal framework, helped the government complete the legal framework. I mean, they actually approved them. And then we have been also, our team has been also looking into the procedures and also tools, as well as the training of the employment staff that are actually looking into the implementation of these revised active labor market measures. I think, bottom line, the self-employment, just if I can finish with this, self-employment, we had piloted and we had done several rounds of pilots with our sort of like funding from the Swiss government. And we are happy that that self-employment is now part of the government ALMPs. And I think Albania, if I'm not mistaken, was the last country in the region that was not having a self-employment program. So I think we have basically have that achievement. And the community employment program, something that has been sort of like discussed and approved, and now it's in the process of implementation, trying to actually use NGOs and use non-governmental organizations to actually do certain public sort of community work that can reach out to those that are vulnerable, or making sure that there is no one left behind, as it were, in our SDG mantra. So I think I'm going to leave it at that, and I can happily answer any questions and have further discussions. Before I finish, I think I also found very interesting the first panel that I followed, the future of work and the platform work, which I think it relates very well with the migration and the fact that the IT sectors are becoming a bit of a priority focus in the Western Balkans. And I think there's definitely some potential work that needs to be done there, linking the labor market measures with the platform work, as well as the outsourcing, which is becoming quite a bit of like economic share in the country. So I'm leaving it at that. So thank you very much, and over.
Thank you, Anna, for this really interesting presentation. Well, as a statistician, I'm always glad to look at information converted into intelligence, and above all, to hear about the power of data. Thank you for this. Cristina, the floor is back to you now.
Okay, thank you. Indeed, the power of data, particularly in this kind of tumultuous time, is extremely important. Thank you already, Anna, for addressing one of the comments we have already received, but I kindly invite you to have a look. We have received a comment, a remark from Mr. Majstorovic, and we will address these additional comments, questions. We invite you, please post your remarks and questions in the chat. Now is the time to move from Albania, to travel fast to the other part of the continent, to Ireland, and I kindly invite our guest, Nora Condon, to present the labor market information reform and the policy changes that they have implemented in the context of pandemic and recovery. Please, Nora, the floor is yours. We can see the presentation. Thank you.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Christina. Thanks very much. And good morning, everybody. It is actually still morning here in Dublin. So as Christina said, my name is Nora Condon, and I'm a senior analyst working in the Skills and Labour Market Research Unit, also known as the SLMRU. So we're a small group of people. We are 5 researchers and a research assistant, and our job is to monitor the supply and demand of skills in Ireland. We are based in Solace, which looks after the planning and funding of education and training, mostly at ISCID level 4, but the SLMRU is rather unusual in that our remit is to cover the entire economy, so all ISCID levels really, if you like, including tertiary right up to ISCID level 8. In this presentation, I'll very quickly outline Ireland's labour market prior to the pandemic. We look at the challenges faced in monitoring labour market intelligence in the pandemic, trying to understand the impact and trying to identify job opportunities so that we can inform skills policy. And then I'll just have a look at a high-level look at some of the success factors that allowed us to embed labour market intelligence in skills policy in Ireland. So immediately prior to COVID-19, Ireland was doing very well. We had actually recovered from the 2008 financial crisis, which had been very severe in Ireland. And in fact, in 2019, employment levels had never been higher. And we still had a small issue with unemployment, but things were moving in the right direction. It was continuing to decline. And then COVID-19 happened. It really affected Ireland from about the end of March 2020. And we suddenly had thousands of people out of work with no income. So the Irish government introduced, as an emergency measure, new income support payments, most of which were managed and administered by the Public Employment Services, although not all of them. There were a few other agencies involved as well. And one of the main challenges for us when we're monitoring labour market developments was the rapid pace of change. No sooner would we get an understanding of the situation when maybe restrictions would be lifted or they'd be reimposed and things would change again. And just to give you an idea of how that happened, this is the number of people receiving one type of pandemic unemployment payment over an 18-month period. And you can see these very rapid changes, those peaks and troughs indicating the changes that were occurring constantly during 2020 and early 2021. However, the main challenge for us in monitoring labour markets and skills in particular had to do with the data. Our main data source is the labour force survey. That gathers all the variables we need to monitor skills. Our main proxy for skills in Ireland is occupation. So either the occupation of the employed or the previous occupation if we're talking about somebody employed. We also use education level, sometimes education field, and of course sector would be important, but age, gender, region, all of those variables are included in the labour force survey. The problem with the labour force survey was the time lag, because to capture the effect of the pandemic, we needed to look at Q2 data, April, May, and June. But that data didn't become available until August. So we really didn't have our primary data source available, but there were others. There was the pandemic unemployment payment, for example, but definitions of employment changed. The labour force survey, probably most of you would already be aware, uses the ILO definition of employment or unemployment, whereas the pandemic unemployment payment recipients were not necessarily unemployed. They were employed, but away from work. So we had to deal with those. Sectoral definitions changed as well. For example, somebody working as a cook in a hospital would say they worked in accommodation and food, but in the labour force survey, they're classified as in working in the health and welfare sector. So we had all those sort of problems and also the variables. Occupation was missing from most of the up-to-date data. And other ones like education would have been missing, but we had sector, we had gender, and we had broad age group. So to try and understand the impact, we went back to the labour force survey, our most comprehensive data source, which we had for every quarter up to Q4 2019. We also were able to access the macroeconomic forecasts produced by other agencies. So the Ministry for Finance, the Central Bank of Ireland, and non-governmental think tanks all produced very broad forecasts of gross national product, gross domestic product, and helpfully for us, employment and unemployment. So we were able to get a broad indication of the magnitude or the anticipated magnitude of the change. The problem is, for example, if there was a projection of an 8% decline in employment, that 8% is not uniformly distributed across all sectors, across all skills. So we used the income support data to gather that. And by linking the three, we were able to get a good picture, not exact numbers, but we didn't need exact numbers. We needed to be able to identify the most affected and least affected. And that's what combining the three data sets allowed us to do. We also had a look at other research, such as automation risk. There was a lot of international work which was adapted to the Irish context on the risk of automation. So we took that into consideration. The OECD had done a paper on remote working by occupation. We were also able to look at that. And also for Ireland, going on in the background all the time was Brexit. And one of the things we took into consideration there was that many of the sectors impacted by COVID were not the sectors expected to be impacted by Brexit. So like Albania, Ireland had a double hit, except our second hit was Brexit. So once we knew where the effects were going to be most prominent, we were able to try then to identify areas where there may still be opportunities either during the pandemic or immediately afterwards. And one of our main data sources there was job vacancy adverts. And we have two. We have the Public Employment Services, which gives us job title. And during 2020, we asked CEDAFOP if we could get access to their data lab behind their OVATE data. And that gave us a very, very large and robust data set on online job vacancies by occupation, by education, and by sector. We also run our own difficult to fill survey. So one of our researchers rings recruitment agencies and she asks them a range of questions on what job titles are you currently experiencing difficulty in getting suitable candidates. And because that's our own survey, we were able to adjust that and add questions on COVID, such as, has COVID affected the availability of staff? Has COVID affected the number of jobs on offer? We also have very strong links with employer engagement. Now, as a unit, we're too small to be able to engage directly with employers ourselves. But the Ministry for Education in Ireland has a network of 9 regional managers whose job it is to liaise directly between education and training in the region and employers in the region. So that was set up in 2016. And we got involved immediately and we trained those managers to capture and report, most importantly, to report the data on skills shortages and skills difficulties. And so what these 3 sources of data really help with is that we get the actual skill, because the CEDAFOP data captures skill as well. So we don't have to use a proxy, we actually get the job title, the occupation, and the skill. And then, of course, we keep an eye on what the government has planned. So the climate change agenda would obviously influence what sort of jobs might be coming up, but also other policies. For example, Ireland intends to increase the number of teaching assistants in schools. So that will also create job opportunities. I've put it up here, interpreted in context, and that's vital when looking at this data set, because none of these data sets are representative of the labour market as a whole. Not all employers will advertise their jobs online. And in fact, online job vacancies are skewed towards higher skills generally. Not all employers will recruit a recruitment agency to do the work for them. And we can't engage with all employers. And very often the engagement with employers often depends on an employer being willing and interested in contacting the education providers. But once they're interpreted in the context of employment growth or unemployment, churn is another important one we get from the Labour Force Survey, monitoring the number of people who change jobs, who change sectors, or new hire data. All of that is available from the CSO. The CSO is our National Statistics Institute. So by combining all of those data sets, we were able to identify vulnerable cohorts, which I think this has been mentioned earlier on. It affected young people, affected women, people in lower skilled occupations, and some sectors more than others. we were able to identify skills demand. So occupations where employers were actually hiring. So one of those ones would have been HGV drivers. Another one would have been process operatives, particularly in the pharmaceutical sector, particularly for people with clean room experience and working in aseptic environments. And then skills shortages, and we always have skills shortages, and they'd usually be, quality control engineers, ICT, software developers. And then finally, we were able to use that information to inform provision, either at an occupation-specific level. So, for example, we were able to say maybe a wind turbine technician would be a suitable occupation, because even though there's no employment right now, because of the climate change agenda, those occupations will be coming down the line, but also transversal skills. We noticed in the data in 2020 that while we have data analysts as an occupation that's in short supply, increasingly we find that occupations will require data analytical skills. So it could be a sales manager with skills in data analytics. So just to give you an example of a skills intervention that was informed by labour market intelligence, we set up the Skills to Compete programme, which was a training intervention. It's not new. It was built on existing provision, but this time it was targeted. And it was targeted not as initially intended at the unemployed, but at people receiving income support payments. And anybody who was unemployed prior to the pandemic, because of course, anybody unemployed prior to the pandemic was unlikely to be able to find a job during the pandemic, and therefore they moved into the long-term unemployed category. All of the programs were offered in areas of identified demand, and I've put that there in purple because that's the area where the skills intelligence was embedded. It was offered with guidance and support, and it had an oversight group composed of education training providers, government ministries, so people looking after the public employment services, education and training, and finally the funders. And that was kind of important as well, because while Skills to Compete was set up as a pilot in 2020, in 2021 it was embedded in Ireland's Recovery and Resilience Programme, so that's the EU funding part of it. So we also have somebody now on the oversight group that looks after the EU funding side of things. So the factors in success then were that, well, no single source of data could tell us what we needed. So we combined a range of different ones. Our links with employers and employer representatives are strong. And this is probably the most important one, is that the SLMRU have a seat at the table at a lot of cross-departmental, cross-ministerial groups, where there's a sharing of expertise and a sharing of knowledge. And that's, for example, where we became aware of the pandemic unemployment payment data. So before it was ever released on the statistical websites, we actually had access to that data. And we also knew about the flaws or the limits, and Eno was talking about the limitations of data as well. And it's important to know where those limits are, because then you can just interpret the data in those contexts. So I'm aware time is running out, so I think I'll end here. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Nora, for your excellent presentation. And I think we have a couple of minutes just to have some answers from your side. And I would start with you, Nora, if you allow me. Looking at the presentation and how you designed the system and how you changed it and so on, one might say, I don't know, probably 100 people work for that. So I think it would be very encouraging for our partner countries to also say and tell them how many people are involved in your unit in this work, and probably the last point that you underline, this collaborative arrangement is somehow the secret, of having such a performing system. But please, Nora, tell us how many people are working in your unit for this, let's say, labor market and skills information update.
So at the moment, there are 5 researchers. That includes the manager, and we have 1 research assistant. And we have an admin assistant as well, a part-time admin assistant who looks after anything got to do with distributing our research. But yeah, we're 6 researchers really, 5 researchers and a research assistant.
Okay, thank you. I mean, this is very important for our countries to really showcase that an analytical, unit in a public employment service or a further skills training authority is rather sufficient as long as there are, this collaboration across sectors and institutions is also secured. I see that Daniela has a question for you, so I would quickly invite Daniela to raise it, please.
Thank you. I wanted to propose that I don't speak at all and we listen for another half an hour to Nora, because it was a brilliant presentation. Nora, you mentioned at one point that you also identify skills shortages in your analytics. Did you identify labor shortages, whereby by labor shortages, I mean occupations for which the physical bodies with the adequate skill sets are there, but they don't want to take up those jobs?
Well, in theory, there wasn't. We did not identify any labor shortages. We couldn't identify labor shortages when we had 500,000 people unemployed, but we identified the shortages for ICT skills, for doctors, but they're skills shortages. So I know that's not what you're talking about. But when you have such a large volume of people who are looking for work, who would be willing to work and available to work, it's difficult to say there is a labor shortage. But yes, certainly there were certain occupations for which, I mean, even now, there are occupations in Ireland that are that are difficult to fill, but we still have a lot of people who are unemployed. So we are reluctant to call them labor shortages when we know the supply of labor. We have a surplus actually on the public employment services system there. So yeah, I don't know, you can't really make people do work if they don't want to. So I see the difficulty, but no, we did not identify labor shortages during the pandemic.
Thank you, Daniela. I mean, this is a real challenge in all our countries, particularly in the transition and developing countries, because it's linked to the quality of the jobs, wage attractiveness, and all these issues. And with that, I think I would turn to Eno now because these are very much linked to the points that Boris has raised in the chat, and it's exactly. And I think Eno, you are the right person to answer, because you are also working on growth and employment aspects in Albania, and not only. So please go ahead.
No, I think what Boris basically sort of like pointed is the challenge that everyone sort of like, it's a big elephant. Honestly, it's I don't know. Obviously, you can only do so much with the activation measures. But I think, there's a situation in the Western Balkans, which I think it's similar, more or less, that we do have the demographics becoming a crucial challenge, and not only just for employment purposes, but with like repercussions on other sort of like aspects, financial aspects, including the pensions. There's a big risk in Albania, and some really like stark, dim analysis are being done about the viability of the pension fund in the country in the next 10 years. So people are migrating, young people are going abroad. There's obviously, I read the other day that Germany is looking for another 1.2 million workers. So I think this is a situation where basically where the work with data can at least help and analyze the drivers of what needs to be done. And I agree, obviously the employment measures, unfortunately, although we are trying so hard to actually raise the bar for the public employment services, so they will not just offer jobs that are those for like the low qualified or unskilled, but even for the higher end. I think, you know, there's a bit of an issue that needs to be addressed. And I think, you know, the data that we have, and actually currently when we speak, and I'm glad that Boris mentioned this, because we are looking into and I think it was mentioned in the other session, the platforms, the work platforms that are actually operational. And we are trying to get some data, some comparative data of the usage of those platforms from Albanian freelancers, you know, to see just to be able to see some sort of like a footprint of Albanian ICTs in these platforms, and see whether, you know, anything can be done about it. I think there are actually platforms in the country. The World Bank is now initiating a huge digital platform, a training skills development platform for digital freelancers. Obviously, the direction is slowly moving around that aspect, but the regulatory work, the fact that, you know, these young people, at least, you know, there's a lot of typologies of young people that would like to migrate, or they can work from here, or mind you, there's another component that it fills in the demographic picture. There is like foreign workers in our countries already. Okay, and we have people from Bangladesh are working, reportedly working in Albanian enterprises, or in the construction industry. You know, obviously this needs to be somehow analyzed, and obviously, you know, I mean, Europe has gone, the EU has gone through this path, like in the past. I'm sure like countries like Ireland or others have gone through this in the past, or Italy. I mean, there's no sort of like wheel to be reinvented. It's just you need to be able to have the capacities and the mindsets of you know, these data sources that need to be analyzed and sort of like hinting to the future. And I mean, the sooner the politicians understand this, you know, the better it will be. I think it's just also a matter of how to get the perfect mix of political sort of like interest and sort of like long-term thinking, which in our transition countries, obviously prolonged transition countries, is sort of like the real issue, like long-term thinking and strategic thinking for the future. So yeah.
Thank you, Enno. I think from my experience, at least I see that there is a progress, and I think in the discussion with Daniela, we can underline that there is a lot of, you know, there is a progress also in the EU neighborhood, but also in the EU member states. Do not forget that also many EU member states are confronted with the same issues. But what I would take from you and Nora as key messages, I think, is this interoperability and cross-institutional collaboration, but also the fact that there is a wealth of resources and sources of data, but they need to be well contextualized. We cannot talk anymore about having a simple employer survey done every quarter or every year, or a simple vacancy monitoring. Now the world has changed completely. And it's not only the task of the Public Employment Service to follow these elements, it's also the task of other institutions and donors. International support is really critical, particularly in the EU member states, but as we have seen also in Nora's examples, European Social Fund or European funding also is supporting such developments also in more, you know, in the EU member states as in the EU neighborhood. So with big thanks to you and Nora, we move now to the last part of our session, and I kindly invite Daniela Zampini to join me in this dialogue. We picked like three topics, big topics that we've seen, because we work very, very closely with ILO Budapest office and ILO Geneva office, and we've seen that particularly in the low and mid income countries, the sources of data, the capacities to look at the labor market and the skills information are still rather underdeveloped, or they do not fully inform the ALMPs design and so on. So do you have some quick fix, or I don't know, longer term recommendations to address these shortcomings from your experience? Please, Daniela.
Well, just some maybe that I can share, in a sense that I think I want to build a little bit on what Enno and Nora presented already, because, you know, we are the last thing before people and their lunches. So let's make this a little bit controversial, Christina. I think the one point that I'm taking from Nora's presentation, which goes in the direction of what you asked me, is that information doesn't only have to be reliable and available, it also has to be timely. And I think that was the beginning of her presentation, because when the COVID crisis struck, the job of analysts became very complicated all of a sudden. And I think Nora found herself in that position. We ourselves, we looked, at that time, our partners in crime were the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction Development. We looked at each other and said, what data do we use to say something meaningful and advise our member states? And we looked at nowcasting, which is, you know, looking at the now instead of looking at trends for in the future, because you really need to have a snapshot of the situation, and whatever you can say in March will not necessarily be interesting to listen to in April. And nowcasting, again, Nora alluded to that. We didn't look at unemployment and also raised the point. We looked at the loss of working hours, because that was a significant indicator to inform schemes. They were not active market measures, they were job retention schemes, income support schemes, and so on, but they were important data. So any disruption or transition, of course, creates these additional segmentations on the labor market, which make our job incredibly difficult. You were alluding to it. It was one of my points that I wanted to bring home. We keep doing these employers survey, skills needs survey, tracer studies. We do them, they make sense, but what else can we do that complements them, that still keeps the relevance, but is more helpful to particularly low and middle income countries in the design of ALMPs, if you want, or any other labor market policy. So I have 3 suggestions that I would like to make real quick. The first one is, again, Nora alluded to it. People with experience and expertise are as important as the data. One of the good critique, for instance, in Serbia to the employers survey or skills needs survey was that the data were a little bit biased to some extent. But if you would run those data by experts who have long-standing knowledge of the labor market, sometimes using Delphi methods in the process, that would make your data a lot more intelligent in a way, and you could use them in a different way. So first suggestion, use your people better, not only the data that you have. The second point, again, it was alluded to. We, in the European Union now, the discussion has become a lot more about transitional labor markets. There is nothing static anymore. As I say, what you say on a Wednesday is not longer valid on a Friday to some extent. I'm exaggerating. So a lot of the analysis that we can do in the public employment services, in the labor market observatories, in the ministries, is to look at flows instead of stocks. We cannot look at the stock of unemployed anymore. We cannot look at the stock of employed anymore. We have to look at people flowing in and out of the labor market. Practical example. The unemployment rate in North Macedonia fluctuated very, very little during the crisis. But what you could see are major cohorts of people moving out of employment and out of unemployment into inactivity. So you have to monitor the flow back from inactivity into the other categories. So bridging the gap between looking at stocks and flows. And last point I wanted to make, it links to this, it says, to understand the labor market and the labor market transitions in a transition labor market, you don't need labor market data only. And Nora pointed out that very, very clearly. You have really to broaden your horizons. A labor market observatory or a group of analysts within the ministry or anything of that sort has to really have a good network of contacts and access to information that's way beyond what you get from a labor force survey, the job vacancy data, or I don't know, the administrative data of the public employment service is not enough anymore. Again, I would like to stop on a practical example. We're working with our good colleagues in Montenegro, for instance, to activate young women. We know that the symbol, the epitome of those hardest hit by the crisis are young women in middle-income countries, particularly if they have family responsibilities, and realized that an important piece of information was not being asked to these women, whether they had kids under the age of 6, which we know is a major factor preventing them going back on the labor market after losing their job during the crisis or being inactive. So the last point is be mindful that a lot of what we're discussing today has to integrate market information, but also non-market information. For instance, whether you have kids under the age of 6. And I think this, for our colleagues designing active labor market measure, is an important piece of information, particularly in these, as you say, unusual times.
Thank you, Daniela. And your last point is very important because we see everywhere in the EU neighborhood and Central Asia that actually the biggest risk is inactivation, not necessarily unemployment. And therefore, for example, what Nora suggested to the fact that they are now able to also properly identify vulnerable cohorts by integrating data other than labor market, is very important and definitely very useful for our countries. Now we move back also forward to the innovation potential in labor market information and skills information systems. And we know that our countries are also not having enough resources, and also the labor market is rather volatile. And I think Anna also mentioned, political decision making, prioritization, long-term strategic planning. So, what is really the potential to have this innovation in place and to have it kind of sustainably implemented?
Well, first of all, again, I would like to build on what was already mentioned, because then we bring home a few points there. When I was trying to vote on the poll, though I know the panelists cannot vote, and I was a little bit upset with Doriana because I wanted to click on all the boxes. And in the ILO, we've written a lot about labor market and skills information systems. And the key mantra that one should go away with is that if you don't, there are 4 elements that need to fall together nicely. If you don't have one of those, you don't have a labor market information system. And I think I've seen this in the slides that were presented before. You need to have the collection and compilation of data. You need to have a repository of data, a physical, though it's digital space where you store the data. You need to have the analytical capacities, but also the tools. So you innovate on the tools that you use to analyze the data. And you need to have, this is critical, the institutional arrangements and the networks in place. Nora highlighted this very well in her last point. They themselves, though well established in the context of Ireland, they had to reach out to a broader network to make their work effective and efficient under pressure. So if one of these 4 pillars of a labor market and skills information system is not in place, you simply don't have one. And we have concrete examples in our region where some of these blocks were in place, but because one was slower than the other, so it didn't happen, then the LMIS, I keep saying LMIS because I forget the skills part, but the information system could not be put in place. As simple as that. So again, what are some of the solutions and what are the elements of innovation there? I would like to open a brackets for an advertisement there. In collaboration with the OECD, the ILO over the past 7 to 10 years has been developing a solution that we can give, thanks to the OECD and all the other participating statistical offices in the world, can be given for free to low and middle income countries. It's a platform that provides free of charge collection, storage, and analytics for labor market information systems. It's called lmis.stat. It can be installed by any of our member states, and because it's the OECD, the ILO, and 10 statistical offices from Italy, France, I think even Morocco, no, Tunisia is participating. But because they update it and they keep it fresh and viable, it's constantly helpful and useful. It doesn't go out of fashion as, you know, when you develop ad hoc platforms that are not backstopped by long-standing commitments. This has costed multiple millions to set up, and as I said, can be made available to our member states in low and middle income countries free of charge. So that's already, you know, it's one pillar of the labor market information system. Is innovative because, again, you do not depend on your individual platform, but you can sort of learn from other experiences. The other element of innovation, again, I think you mentioned, Christina, a few seconds ago, is interoperability. But there has to be something meaningful behind that. Again, with some of the countries in the Western Balkan region, we have worked on interoperability action plans, which even made more sense during the crisis. Practical example, people could not go during the crisis to register personally or to bring their certificates of their skills to the public employment services. All of this should be automatically sourced by the employment agency when you put your unique identifier number. They should be able to have that information, so you don't have to travel around with your skills certification, right? It is somewhere and it's linked to your profile. Same with the tax authority. You wanted to maybe interrupt me?
Yeah, no, we need to compress.
Yes, well, I was coming.
Not to forget about the youth. Yeah, that's why.
Not forget about you. So coming to a conclusion, interoperability has to be meaningful. And that's why I think the innovation there, instead of investing in major undertakings, should be really to proceed with semantic interoperability to start with. Nora mentioned definitions, right? Technical interoperability and so on. I think this is an innovation, but it's a relatively cheaper way forward. I will stop there so that we can move forward.
Definitely, and also for this interoperability, I think there is a huge cross-country learning opportunity as well as for the online vacancy studies, because we do not have to reinvent the wheel in each and every country. There are some shortcuts that we can transfer from one country into another. And I know that ILO also ETF is working on that, and like UNDP and other organizations. So definitely we would recommend that. Daniela, we know that the young people are the biggest victims, let's say, of this crisis. Not only them, but I would say that given the impact on the education and all these restrictions, they are the most affected in after this crisis. So I want you to say a couple of words about the policy priorities for young people. So now we can move more into the policy responses.
Absolutely.
1 minute, please. Thank you.
Oh yeah, very fast. On the 4th of November, the ILO's governing body in Geneva will be discussing of the follow-up to the call for action that was issued in 2012 after what has now been called the Great Recession. And it's quite telling that we are now, not even 10 years later in a sort of a similar situation. And when the call for action was issued in 2012, one of the responses at the European Union level was the introduction of the youth guarantee. Universal, gives an opportunity to all young people. We all became acquainted at that time with the Not in Education, Employment and Training acronym. It is in the SDGs. And that was a big policy innovation. Not even 10 years later, say in similar circumstances, the Western Balkan economists have made a similar commitment now just in July in Slovenia. And they've signed up this declaration where they would like, as part of the European investment plan in the Western Balkans, to introduce youth guarantee schemes in the Western Balkan economies. It is a great innovation. The policy principles underpinning the youth guarantee are quite unique. As I mentioned, universal access, policy integration, meaning across employment, education, social protection, youth and gender policies. So everything needs to be operational. It is not an active labor market policy. We clarified that. It is a policy instrument of a complex one, a multi-layered one. And also tackling some of the issues that you alluded to when talking about, we talked about inactivity and we talked about labor shortages. It established also this principle of mutual obligation. Public institutions are there to provide you with a safety net whether it's a good quality offer of employment, further education, apprenticeships, traineeships, but at the same time, you have to be active. You have to accept these quality offers. You are accountable as well. And this is another big innovation. I'm sure that Nora will have interesting stories to tell about how it was implemented with the EU member states. Maybe a few years down the line, we will need to, again, to come together and brainstorm as to how the principles were extended to the Western Balkan economies, what were the implications, and what the data can tell us about how successful the youth guarantee has been.
Definitely, Daniela, and also I would say that this would be the priority of the next year, also for us, for ETF, for ILO, and for other institutions to help the EU neighborhood countries, not only in the Western Balkans, but also we see that in Eastern Europe and CEMED and in Central Asia, this idea of integrated policymaking for young people is gaining track, and we need to provide the support. So,
and the last element of plugging in an advertisement is indeed the European Commission with the ETF and the ILO. We created a technical assistance facility, which is available to the countries, and they can access it, and they can get experienced technical advice from the ETF experts or the ILO experts on how to set it up. So it can happen fast to keep pace with the demands of the European Commission.
Definitely. Thank you very much, Daniela. Thank you, Nora. Thank you, Erno. And thank you, Doriana, for your contribution. We stop here now, but we will continue for next year. Definitely, we will address again these topics. Now it's my pleasure to pass the floor to my colleague, Franca Crestani, who coordinates also the ETF work in Eastern European countries, and she will kindly conclude the event. Please, Franca.
Thank you very much, Christina. It's my pleasure to make the conclusions of this very interesting morning, full of ideas and reflections. We had 3 sessions. The first one looking at new forms of employment, the second one of recovery and gender equality, and the third one of how to capture socio-economic context in active labor market policies. I would say that the common point of all these 3 sessions is the perspective of policy responses. How policies, policy making can respond to all these challenges. Of course, we are seeing the situation during the pandemic, raising more and more the issue of the social dimension. To answer and the issue of complexity in all these topics we have looked for. We have seen the emerging needs from the socioeconomic environment, and in the second session in particular, the response in terms of social enterprise and social unmet needs in particular. So to give also a voice to this part of the economy that is represented by the social partners. This is the right time to do that. And then in the end, the reflection of the keywords we can say is the power of data, how to inform in a timely manner the skills policy development. All of the speakers, I would like to thank very much all the speakers, because all of them have been able to bring a specific perspective in all this debate. It's a complex environment, a complex debate, and the answers cannot be simple. And it's very clear that to reply, to meet all these challenges is not anymore possible to do it from a single perspective, but only putting the forces together. So to answer the complexity, in the socioeconomic dimension through dialogue, partnership, cooperation, and using, as it was said by one of the last speakers, using the people expertise at the same level as the data in terms of figures and numbers. This is the shift in front of us to use the potential of the people working in the fields and putting together all the expertise in order to provide really policy advice to the policymakers. This, in few words, I would say can be the conclusion of this morning. And then I would like to say just a bit more on what this project, this ETF project, is planning for 2022. It's organized around 4 clusters, looking at youth employment and skills development, activation of strategies, and focusing on specific topics like career guidance and coaching and work-based learning. The particularity of this perspective of this project is to implement activities to create strategic alliances and partnerships in order to be in the rightful position to provide policy advice on evidence-based and tailored information. So, and provide a tailored policy advice. In terms of ETF regional activities for next year, we can say that in the 4 regions where ETF is active, the Mediterranean area, the Western Balkans, the Eastern Partnership, and Central Asia, in all of them, the focus is on skills development for active labor market policies, with a particular focus on youth guarantee for the Western Balkans and active labor market policies and public employment services for the Eastern Partnership under the umbrella of the EU initiative EU for Youth. So in few words, I would say this is what ETF is planning to do in the framework of this project next year. And I would like to add that you will receive, all the participants in a few days will receive all the PowerPoint presentations and all the reflections made in the chat by email. By Verena. And it's lunchtime already. I would like just to take the opportunity to thank everybody very much, all the speakers, the participants, the logistic organizers of the event, and of course, last but not least, the interpreters who have done really a great job dealing with many languages. So thank you all very much. We will keep in touch. We can continue exchanging on this topic and working together during next year. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All the best.
Okay.